My HOA Karen kept running over my mailbox, but this was never an accident. This was a war. So I installed a reinforced one she never saw coming, and her face when she hit it was priceless. Every morning, I'd find it smashed on the ground, and she'd just smirk from her window, waving her little rule book. She thought she was just breaking a metal box, but she was attacking my family's pride. What she didn't realize was that I was onto her bigger, more sinister game. This was just the first step in her plan to run me out of my own home. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness some solid steel justice. And if you believe every homeowner deserves to feel safe from HOA bullies, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the moment this power-tripping Karen gets exactly what she deserves. The Saturday morning sun was just starting to warm the driveway when I saw it. I had my favorite mug in hand, the heavy ceramic one Maria gave me, filled with fresh coffee. I was just planning my day, maybe fix that squeaky hinge on the shed, maybe just sit on the porch. Then my eyes landed on the curb. My mailbox wasn't just dented, it was annihilated. It was lying on its side, twisted off the post, the door hanging open like a broken jaw. It was the third time in 2 months. The first time, I thought it was a random act of teenage nonsense. The second time, I got suspicious. This time, seeing it mangled in the dew-soaked grass, I knew exactly who was responsible. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a message. I looked across the street, and there she was, Karen Whitmore, our HOA president, standing on her own perfectly manicured lawn, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She was pretending to inspect Mr. Henderson's rose bushes, but her eyes were locked on me. As soon as our gazes met, a slow, smug smile spread across her face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "I did this, and you can't prove a thing." She gave a little nod, almost a bow, then turned back to her clipboard, making a note. She was a master of making you feel powerless. Her whole life seemed to revolve around walking the neighborhood, finding tiny infractions, and making everyone miserable under the guise of maintaining property values. Her car, a pristine white SUV with tires that always looked a little too big for the vehicle, was parked perfectly in her driveway. I'd seen the tire tracks near my curb before. They matched. That mailbox wasn't just some cheap tin box from a big box store. Maria and I had built it ourselves the first summer we moved into this house, 30 years ago. I'd welded the steel post, and she'd painted it a deep forest green to match the trim on our house. Our son, Mark, had put his little handprint in the wet concrete at the base when he was 5 years old. Every dent and scratch told a story. Now, it was a crumpled heap of metal and memories. It was the place we got his college acceptance letter, the congratulations card when I got my promotion, the endless stream of catalogs Maria loved to flip through. For Karen, it was just a rule violation waiting to happen. For me, it was a piece of my home. It was the first line of defense, the little gatehouse to our life, and she was deliberately, repeatedly, running it over in the dead of night. It was an invasion. I decided to try the civilized route one last time. I walked back inside, leaving my coffee on the counter, and called the official HOA management company number. Of course, the call was routed directly to Karen's cell phone. She picked up on the first ring, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I kept my voice steady, calm. I explained what I'd found. I described the damage, the tire tracks, and I even mentioned this was the third time. I suggested we look at security footage, maybe file a joint police report for vandalism in the neighborhood. I was trying to give her an out, a chance to pretend she cared. I even said, my insurance will cover some of it, but I'd like to work with the HOA to prevent it from happening again. There was a short, sharp laugh on the other end of the line. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice turning hard and condescending, "as per Section 7, Paragraph C of the covenants, all curbside installations must adhere to setback and material requirements. Frankly, your mailbox has been a known issue. It's slightly outside the mandated 6-inch curb clearance. Perhaps, if it were installed correctly, these unfortunate accidents wouldn't happen. I could feel the blood rising to my face. I'd measured it myself. It was perfect. Karen, it's exactly 6 inches from the curb. And even if it weren't, that doesn't give someone the right to destroy it. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind you use on a toddler who just doesn't understand. The board's position is that non-compliant structures pose a hazard. We can't be responsible for the consequences. I'll be sending you a formal notice to replace it with an approved model from the HOA catalog. Failure to comply will result in a daily fine. She was doubling down. Not only was she admitting nothing, she was using her position to blame me, to fine me for the damage she herself had caused. She was daring me to challenge her. It was a classic power play. She wanted me to get angry, to yell, so she could report me for harassment. I just said, "Okay, Karen, I'll look for the notice," and hung up before I said something I'd regret. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. This wasn't about a mailbox anymore. This was about a bully who had gotten a little bit of power and decided to build her own little kingdom on our street. But as I looked at the wreckage, a small, stubborn thought flickered in my mind. She was just one person. The rest of the board, Tom, Linda, the others, they were mostly reasonable people. They were my neighbors. Surely, if I laid it all out for them in a clear, logical email, they'd see how insane this was. They'd step in. She couldn't get away with this forever. I held on to that flicker of hope. It was a mistake, of course, but at that moment, it was the only thing stopping me from doing something much, much more direct. My brief flicker of hope in the HOA board was extinguished within 48 hours. On Monday afternoon, a crisp white envelope was sticking out of the temporary, cheap mailbox I'd put up. It wasn't mail. It was a formal violation notice. My name and address were printed in a sharp, unforgiving font. Inside, a letter signed by Karen Whitmore, President, informed me I was being fined $50 for a non-compliant curbside receptacle and another $100 for failure to maintain property in accordance with aesthetic guidelines, referring to the mangled remains of my old mailbox that I hadn't even had time to haul away yet. The letter ended with a chillingly polite sentence. "We trust you will rectify this situation promptly to avoid further penalties." It was a declaration of war, printed on official letterhead. That was only the beginning. Karen's campaign escalated from bureaucratic to personal with terrifying speed. A few days later, another notice appeared, this time taped to my front door. It was a warning for having a visible garden hose, which had been coiled neatly by the spigot for 15 years. Then came a fine for a small patch of clover in the lawn, something she must have spotted with binoculars from her front window. It felt like I was living under a microscope. Her white SUV started doing slow, deliberate drive-bys, her head turning to stare at my house as if she were a general inspecting enemy territory. She was trying to break me with 1,000 paper cuts, to make my own home feel like a prison. My pride, my sense of fairness, my simple right to exist without being harassed. It all felt like it was being methodically dismantled, one bogus fine at a time. The worst part was how she turned the neighborhood against me. I saw it happen in real time. One afternoon, I was in my garage, sharpening a set of lawnmower blades, when I saw her talking to Mrs. Gable next door. Mrs. Gable is a sweet woman in her 80s who has lived on this street longer than anyone. Maria and I help her with her groceries and shovel her walk in the winter. Karen stood on her lawn, clipboard in hand, pointing toward my house and talking in that low, urgent tone people use when they're spreading gossip. Mrs. Gable just nodded, looking down at her feet. The next morning, when I waved to her as she got her newspaper, she gave me a weak, nervous little smile and hurried back inside without a word. It was like a poison spreading through the community. People I'd known for decades, people I'd shared beers with at block parties, started avoiding my eyes. When I'd walk my dog, conversations would stop. Neighbors would suddenly find something fascinating about their shoes until I passed. Karen wasn't just attacking me. She was isolating me, painting me as a troublemaker, a problem that needed to be managed. They were all afraid of getting a notice of their own. Maria saw the toll it was taking on me. I was angry all the time, pacing the kitchen at night, running through arguments in my head. "Jack, just pay the fines," she said one evening, her voice gentle. "It's not worth it. She's a miserable person who wants to make everyone else miserable. Let's just not play her game." I knew she was trying to protect me, to protect our peace, but what she was saying felt like surrender. "Maria, it's not about the money," I told her, my voice tight. "It's the principle. This is our home. We built a life here. I'm not going to let some power-hungry bully with a clipboard dictate how we live in it. If we give in on this, what's next? The color of our front door? The type of flowers we plant? Where does it end?" She didn't have an answer, and I knew she understood. This wasn't just about a mailbox or a garden hose. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to push you out of your own life. My final desperate attempt at reason was an email I sent to the entire HOA board. I laid it all out. I attached pictures of the destroyed mailbox, screenshots of the tire tracks, a detailed timeline of the events, and a calm, rational explanation of how these actions felt like targeted harassment. I was professional. I was respectful. I asked for mediation. I appealed to them as my neighbors, as fellow homeowners who surely valued peace and quiet over petty tyranny. For 2 days, there was silence. Then, a reply finally came. It was a single, curt paragraph from the HOA's general email account, but I knew Karen had written it. It stated that the board had full confidence in President Whitmore's enforcement of community covenants and considered the matter closed. That was it. No investigation, no questions, no mediation. Just a bureaucratic brick wall. It was then that I truly understood there was no reasoning with these people. The rules weren't there to keep the neighborhood nice. They were there to give people like Karen a weapon. They didn't care about fairness or reality. They only cared about their flimsy, imaginary power. Standing there in my quiet office, reading that email on the screen, a cold calm washed over me. The anger was still there, but it wasn't hot anymore. It had cooled and hardened into something else. Resolve. Maria was right about one thing. It was time to stop playing her game. It was time to start playing mine. And my game had very different rules. That email from the board wasn't a defeat. It was a release. It cut the last thread of hope I had in playing by their rules and set me free. All the frustration that had been churning in my gut for weeks settled into a cold, hard point of clarity. There would be no more polite phone calls, no more carefully worded emails. The time for talking was over. The time for building had begun. That night, I didn't pace the kitchen. I went into my garage, closed the big door, and turned on the lights. This was my space. The air smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and hot metal, the smell of getting things done. I rolled out a big sheet of brown paper on my workbench and started to sketch. I wasn't designing a mailbox. I was designing a fortress. My mind went back to my years in the trades, working on commercial sites. We built things to last, things that could withstand abuse. I started thinking about bollards, those short, thick posts you see outside of government buildings and storefronts, designed to stop a car dead in its tracks. The principle was simple. A strong enough post, sunk deep enough into a massive concrete footing, becomes part of the earth. You don't hit the post, you hit the planet. I spent hours online, not on HOA forums, but on engineering sites and metal fabrication forums. I looked at designs for reinforced barriers and anti-ram installations. My plans started to take shape, piece by piece. It wouldn't just be strong, it would be smart. It had to look, from a distance, like a normal, albeit sturdy, mailbox. The surprise was the whole point. The next day, I called my old friend, Tom Reynolds. Tom and I go way back. We worked on a few construction crews together before he went into the Army as an engineer. He's the kind of guy who can build a bridge out of scrap metal and sheer willpower. I knew he'd get a kick out of this. I didn't even have to explain much. "Tom, it's Jack. I've got an HOA problem that requires a structural solution. There was a chuckle on the other end of the line. "Let me guess. The dragon lady with the clipboard?" he said. "The very same," I replied. "I need something that won't move. Ever." He told me to come by his workshop that afternoon. Tom's place is a wonderland of lathes, welders, and half-finished projects. He listened to my plan, nodding slowly, a grin spreading across his face. He didn't question it. He just made it better. 4-inch steel pipe is good, he said, tapping my sketch with a calloused finger. But you want Schedule 80, thicker walls. And for the inside, don't leave it hollow. Fill it with concrete and rebar before you cap it. It'll be a monster. He pointed me toward a steel supplier he trusted, a place that wouldn't ask too many questions. The final piece of his advice was crucial. Bury it deep, Jack. At least 4 feet. A 3-foot concrete footing isn't a suggestion. It's a requirement. With the plan solidified, I became a sort of forensic engineer in my own front yard. I had taken detailed pictures of each destroyed mailbox. Now, I laid them out on my workbench like evidence in a crime lab. I measured the height of the impact marks, the angle of the dents. Karen's SUV had a specific bumper height, and she always seemed to hit it with the front passenger side, clipping it as she pulled away from the curb. The damage wasn't from a head-on collision. It was a powerful, deliberate sideswipe. I calculated the kinetic energy in my head. A 2-ton vehicle, even moving at a slow 5 or 10 miles an hour, delivers thousands of pounds of force. A standard mailbox post is designed to break away for safety. Mine would do the opposite. It would be an anchor. It would be immovable. I worked in secret, mostly at night. The big garage door stayed shut, the windows covered. I'd wait until I saw the lights go out in Karen's house across the street. Then I'd get to work. The hum of my welder was a low, satisfying sound in the quiet of the night. I cut the thick-walled steel pipe to length. I welded a 1/4-inch thick steel plate to the bottom to anchor it into the concrete. To test the concept, I took a shorter offcut of the same pipe, welded it to a small plate, and set it in a 5-gallon bucket of concrete in my backyard. After it cured for a few days, I took my 16-pound sledgehammer to it. The hammer bounced off with a loud clang that echoed through the yard, leaving nothing but a small scuff in the paint. My hands vibrated from the impact, but the post didn't move a millimeter. A smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I'd had in weeks. Hope was back, and it felt like solid steel. But I was getting careless. The late nights, the clang of metal, the occasional flash from the welder. I thought I was being quiet, but I had underestimated my enemy's vigilance. One night, around 1 a.m., as I was grinding down a weld, I saw a flicker of movement through a gap in the window covering. It was the slow, sweeping headlights of Karen's SUV, doing a crawl past my house. She wasn't just passing by. She was patrolling. The beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, pausing on my garage door. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly shut off my tools and stood there in the dark, not moving a muscle, until I heard her engine fade into the distance. She knew I was up to something. The next day, another notice was taped to my door, this one citing a rule about unauthorized construction or fabrication activities without prior architectural review. The net was tightening. My secret project now had a deadline, and I had a sinking feeling that Karen Whitmore was already planning her next attack. Karen's suspicion was like a pressure cooker with the heat turned up. The finds became more frequent, more absurd. A notice for improperly stored recycling bins appeared the morning after I'd rolled them to the curb for pickup. Another for a seasonal decoration displayed past the approved date, a small patriotic wreath Maria had forgotten to take down after the 4th of July. Each one was a jab, a reminder that she was watching, that she had the full, mindless weight of the HOA behind her. She was no longer content just targeting me. She began to weaponize the fear she'd sown in the neighborhood, turning it into a tool of oppression. I watched her from my living room window as she had a friendly chat with Dave Miller, who lives 2 doors down. Dave is a good guy, a single dad with 2 young kids. He's always been friendly, but lately he'd been avoiding eye contact. Karen was standing on his lawn, clipboard in hand, pointing at the small playset in his backyard. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the color drain from Dave's face. He just kept nodding, his shoulders slumping. Later that day, Dave came over, looking apologetic. "Jack, I can't get involved," he stammered, his eyes fixed on his feet. "She was here for an hour, telling me my kid's swing set isn't on the approved vendor list. She said she could have it removed at my expense. She mentioned you. Said that homeowners who cause trouble often find the HOA has to scrutinize their properties more closely." It was a threat, plain and simple. She was holding his kid's happiness hostage to ensure his silence. I told him I understood that he had to do what was best for his family. But as he walked away, a wave of despair washed over me. I was completely on my own. That evening at dinner, the strain was visible on Maria's face. The constant stream of fines, the cold shoulders from neighbors, the late nights I was spending in the garage. It was all taking its toll. "Jack, is this really worth it?" she asked, pushing a piece of chicken around her plate. Her voice was quiet, weary. "Maybe we should just buy one of her stupid, approved mailboxes. We can pay the fines. We can paint the fence. We can just make it all go away. I hate this feeling. I feel like we're prisoners in our own home." I looked at my wife, the strongest person I know, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes. And for a moment, I felt myself waver. Was she right? Was I just being stubborn, sacrificing our peace for a battle of wills? The image of Karen's smirking face flashed in my mind, and the resolve hardened in my chest again. "If we give in now, Maria, she'll never stop," I said. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about Dave's kids. It's about Mrs. Gable being afraid to say hello. Bullies don't stop when you give them what they want. They just take more." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, reaching across the table to take my hand. But the doubt hung in the air between us. It felt like Karen was winning. She was an expert at psychological warfare, using bureaucratic red tape as her weapon of choice. She filed a formal complaint with the city, falsely reporting that I was running an unpermitted commercial welding business out of my garage, which triggered a visit from a zoning officer. I had to walk him through my personal projects, explaining that I was a hobbyist, wasting half of a precious Tuesday. He was understanding, but it was another cut, another drain on my time and energy. It seemed like for every step forward I took in the garage, she pushed me 2 steps back with her paper-based assaults. The fortress for my mailbox was nearly complete, painted and ready for installation, but what good was it if I was being fined and harassed into submission before I could even get it in the ground? For the first time, I felt a genuine sense of hopelessness. She was just a woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands, but she was grinding me down with the sheer, relentless force of her pettiness. Just when I thought the isolation was complete, a small act of solidarity came from an unexpected place. I was out in the yard, digging the deep, 4-foot hole for the new mailbox post under the cover of twilight, when a familiar truck pulled up. It was Tom. He got out, holding 2 coffees and a bag of donuts. He didn't say much. He just looked at the hole, then at me. "Looks like you could use an extra shovel," he said with a wry smile. He didn't care about Karen's threats. He wasn't afraid. For the next hour, we worked in relative silence. The only sounds the rhythmic scrape of our shovels against the earth and the occasional shared grunt of effort. His presence was more than just a helping hand. It was a lifeline. It was a quiet rebellion, a statement that Karen's campaign of fear had not completely broken the spirit of the neighborhood. While I had been focusing on building a physical defense, Tom reminded me that true strength comes from not having to stand alone. He was my first ally, and his simple act of showing up reignited the fire in my belly. Karen thought she had me cornered, that she had me beat. She had no idea that we were just getting started. The hole was dug, and the trap was ready to be set. The night of the installation was cool and starless. Tom came over just after 11, his truck coasting to a quiet stop at the curb. We didn't need many words. We were 2 guys with a mission. Working under the dim glow of a single shielded work light, we mixed 80-pound bags of concrete in a wheelbarrow, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel the only sound breaking the silence. This wasn't just concrete. It was an anchor, It was 30 years of frustration, a foundation of pure defiance. With a shared grunt, we lifted the steel beast I'd built, the Schedule 80 pipe, filled with its own core of rebar and concrete, and slid it into the 4-foot hole. We used a level to make sure it was perfectly plumb, then poured the footing, shovelful by shovelful, until the hole was filled. The steel post now rose from the ground as if it had grown there, a part of the earth itself. On top, I carefully bolted the new mailbox, a heavy-gauge steel box, painted the same forest green as our house trim. It looked respectable, solid, deceptively simple. By 2 a.m., we were done. We'd packed away the tools, swept the driveway clean, and covered the fresh concrete with a damp cloth to help it cure. "She's not gonna know what hit her," Tom whispered, a wide grin on his face as he drove away. I stood on my lawn for a long time, just looking at it. It was more than a mailbox. It was a statement. The next few days were a quiet, nerve-wracking waiting game. Every time I heard a car slow down, my head would snap up. Maria was on edge, peeking through the blinds every few minutes. "What if she just calls the city and has them tear it out?" she asked. "Let her try," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "She has to prove it violates a code first, and it doesn't." Karen's white SUV did its slow patrols, morning and night. I could feel her eyes on the new mailbox. She'd slowed down, almost to a stop, studying it. She knew it was different. It was thicker, more substantial. But she couldn't see the 4 feet of steel and 300 pounds of concrete buried beneath it. Her arrogance wouldn't let her imagine what I'd done. She just saw a bigger target. The moment came on a Thursday afternoon, just before dusk. I was in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee, when I saw her SUV pull out of her driveway. But instead of turning down the street, she drove straight across, her headlights off. This was it. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my phone and hit record, holding it steady through the window. She wasn't going fast, maybe 10 miles an hour, but she had that familiar, determined look on her face. She lined up the front passenger side bumper, the same spot she'd used to destroy the others. It was happening at the perfect time. Dave Miller was outside, half-heartedly watering a patch of brown grass, his back to the street. Mrs. Gable was sitting on her porch swing, enjoying the evening air. They were about to have a front-row seat. Karen made her move. She turned the wheel slightly, aiming to clip the post in a brutal sideswipe, the same way a bully knocks a book out of your hands in the hallway. I braced myself, and then came the sound. It wasn't the crumpling, tinny crunch I was used to. It was a deep, resonant, and utterly final boom. It sounded like a car hitting a bridge abutment. The mailbox didn't budge. It didn't lean. It didn't sway. It didn't even vibrate. It just stood there, a silent, immovable object. Her 2-ton SUV, however, reacted violently. The front passenger tire blew with a loud hiss. The vehicle lurched to a stop, its front end twisted at an ugly angle. The fender was buckled, pushed back into the wheel well, and the headlight was smashed, dangling by a few wires. For a second, there was a dead, shocked silence. Then, Karen's car door flew open. She stumbled out, her face a mask of pure disbelief. She stared at my mailbox, which was completely unharmed, not even a scratch on the paint. Then she looked at the mangled front corner of her precious SUV. A low, guttural sound of rage escaped her throat. Dave Miller had dropped his hose and was staring, his mouth wide open. Across the street, Mrs. Gable had stood up from her swing, her hand covering her mouth. Several other neighbors were now peeking out their windows. The smirk was gone. The clipboard authority was gone. All that was left was a woman standing in the middle of the street next to her wrecked car, which she had just destroyed by driving it into a mailbox. Her credibility was bleeding out all over the asphalt. She looked up and saw me standing in my window, my phone still pointed at her. Our eyes met, and the look on her face shifted from shock to pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just pointed a trembling finger at me, then at the mailbox, then back at me. She got back in her crippled car, the engine groaning as she forced it to limp back into her driveway, leaving a trail of fluid and a long black scrape on the road. I knew, with absolute certainty, this fight wasn't over. I had won the physical battle, but she was already planning her next move. The war was about to move indoors, and she was going to use every rule, every bylaw, and every bit of her manipulative power to make me pay. The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. It was going to be a showdown. The 2 weeks leading up to the HOA meeting were a masterclass in Karen's brand of bureaucratic warfare. My mailbox, the silent victor of our last battle, became the subject of a barrage of official-looking letters. One cited it as an unapproved structural modification. Another claimed it was a hazardous installation due to its impenetrable nature, which was my personal favorite. She was trying to build a paper trail to frame me as a reckless rogue who had endangered the community. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Her damaged SUV was gone, replaced by a generic rental sedan. But the long, dark scrape on the asphalt in front of my house remained, a silent testament to the truth. Whispers followed me down the street, but something had changed. The fear in my neighbor's eyes was being replaced by a flicker of curiosity, of defiance. The spectacle of Karen wrecking her own car had cracked the foundation of her authority. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It was usually just the board and a handful of the same complainers. But tonight, nearly every household was represented. People were standing along the back wall. Dave Miller was there. Mrs. Gable was there, sitting in the front row. Tom had a seat in the back, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, a silent pillar of support. Maria sat beside me, her hand resting on a thick file folder in her lap. My own folder felt heavy with the weight of facts. The air was thick with tension. At the front of the room, Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by her nervous-looking vice president, Linda Harper. She banged her gavel, her movements sharp and overly aggressive. "This meeting of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice strained. She breezed through the old business, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge her. Then she arrived at the main event. "New business, item 1, she said, her gaze locking onto me. "The unapproved and hazardous installation at 212 Oak Street." She launched into a prepared speech, her voice dripping with false concern. She talked about public safety, potential liability, and the clear violation of established architectural guidelines. She painted me as an outlaw, a man who had taken matters into his own hands, endangering children and property with a dangerous roadside object. She proposed an emergency motion to have my mailbox professionally removed at my expense and to levy the maximum possible fine for noncompliance. She looked around the room, expecting the usual silent, fearful agreement. But tonight, the room was just quiet, waiting. When she finished, she looked at me with a triumphant smirk. "Mr. Thompson, does the homeowner in question have anything to say before the board votes?" This was the moment I had been preparing for. I stood up slowly, the folder in my hand. "I do, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and steady. The whole room was focused on me. "You're right about one thing. There is a safety issue on our street, but it's not my mailbox." I opened my folder. For the past 3 months, my property was deliberately and repeatedly vandalized. I walked to the front of the room and placed a series of large, clear photographs on an easel for everyone to see. The first 3 destroyed mailboxes. This wasn't teenagers. This was targeted. I then held up the stack of violation notices Karen had sent me. While my property was being destroyed, this is what our HOA president was focused on. I read them out loud, one by one. Fine, $75 for a visible garden hose. Fine, $50 for a patch of clover. Fine, $100 for a patriotic wreath left up 3 days past the approved date. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Neighbors were looking at each other, nodding. They'd all received notices just as ridiculous. Karen's face began to tighten. "Mr. Thompson, that's entirely irrelevant to the matter at hand," she snapped. "Oh, I think it's very relevant," I said, turning to face my neighbors. "It shows a pattern of harassment, a pattern of a president who uses fines and threats to intimidate residents. Some of you, I said, my eyes finding Dave Miller's, were even warned not to associate with me, threatened with your own violations if you did. Dave looked down, but not before a dozen other people saw the truth in his expression. The murmur in the room grew louder. Karen banged her gavel. This is out of order. We are voting on the motion. Just one more thing before you vote, I said, pulling out my phone. I think the community should see exactly what kind of safety hazard we're dealing with. I had already connected my phone to the room's small projector. Before she could object, I hit play. The video filled the screen on the wall behind her. The room fell silent. They saw her white SUV. They saw it line up with my mailbox. They saw the deliberate turn of the wheel. And then they heard it. The loud, violent boom that echoed through the clubhouse speakers, followed by the hiss of a dying tire. The video showed her getting out, her face contorted in disbelief, and then rage. It showed the wrecked SUV and the perfectly untouched mailbox. And most importantly, it showed the complete and total absence of any other cars, children, or pedestrians. The only danger on that street was the person behind the wheel. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was undeniable. Karen sat there, frozen, her face as white as a sheet. That's been altered. It's a fake, she stammered, but her voice was weak, pathetic. No one believed her. Then, a voice, small but clear, cut through the silence. It was Mrs. Gable. She stood up, looking directly at Karen. Is this why you ran over my prize-winning petunias last month, Karen? Because you said my garden edging was an inch too high? Before Karen could answer, Dave Miller stood up. You did threaten me. You used my kid's swing set to try and silence me. Suddenly, the dam broke. A dozen voices rose at once, people sharing their own stories of Karen's bullying, her threats, her absurd fines. It was a flood of pent-up frustration and anger. She had terrorized everyone, and now, all at once, they were no longer afraid. Karen banged her gavel frantically, yelling for order, but she had lost all control. The room had turned on her completely. I just stood back and watched. My work was done. I hadn't raised my voice. I had simply shown them the truth. In the court of public opinion, right here in this little clubhouse, the verdict was in. Her reign was over. The chaos in the clubhouse didn't end in shouting. It crystallized into action. While Karen sat stunned and speechless, another board member, a quiet accountant named Arthur who Karen usually steamrolled, stood up. He calmly invoked a bylaw for an emergency vote of no confidence. It required a simple majority of homeowners present. Hands shot up all over the room, fast and decisive. It wasn't even close. In the space of 5 minutes, Karen Whitmore went from president to pariah, stripped of her title and her power by the very people she had tried to control. She didn't say a word. She just gathered her papers, her face a rigid mask of fury, and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. A spontaneous cheer erupted. It was a sound I hadn't heard in our neighborhood for a very long time. The sound of relief. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With Karen gone, the remaining board members, led by a newly emboldened Arthur, moved to undo the damage. Every fine she had issued against me was rescinded. An emergency committee was formed to review all fines issued in the past year, and nearly all of them were thrown out. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed overnight. It was like a fog had lifted. People started talking to each other again. Dave Miller's kids were back on their swing set. Mrs. Gable's garden edging was suddenly a non-issue. The following weekend, Tom and I, along with a few other neighbors, organized a small neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't a planned event. It just sort of happened. We rolled a grill out onto my driveway, and people just started showing up with chairs and side dishes. We stood around, eating burgers and talking, and for the first time in months, it felt like a community again. Karen didn't go quietly into the night, but her final attempts to cause trouble were pathetic. She called the police to report my mailbox as an illegal road obstruction. A bored-looking officer came out, took one look at it, measured its distance from the curb, and told her it was perfectly compliant with all city ordinances. He also took a look at the video I had saved on my phone. He advised her that deliberately striking it again could be considered filing a false insurance claim, which was a felony. We never heard from the police again. A week later, a for sale sign appeared on her perfectly manicured lawn. 2 months after that, a moving truck pulled up, and just like that, she was gone. No one waved goodbye. With the threat gone, my mailbox settled into its role as a quiet, sturdy landmark. It became a bit of a local legend. Neighbors would walk by and give it a friendly pat, a silent thank you. One day, I came out to find that someone had planted a small, cheerful-looking flower at its base. Maria and I decided it needed a name. We didn't name it after a battle or a victory. We named it the Sentinel, because that's what it had become, a guardian of our peace, a symbol of standing your ground. It was more than just steel and concrete. It was a monument to the simple idea that your home is your own, and you have the right to defend it from petty tyrants. The righteous anger I'd felt had cooled, leaving behind a calm, quiet pride. I had faced a bully, not with fists or fury, but with patience, skill, and a little bit of cleverly engineered steel. The solidarity of the neighborhood had been broken by fear, but it was forged anew in the fight for fairness. And standing there on my driveway, coffee in hand, looking at that simple, solid, forest green mailbox, I knew that our little corner of the world was finally, truly, safe again. Justice had been restored, one immovable object at a time.